Hello, and welcome to Psych 319, Chapter 9, Part 1. This lecture is about concepts and categories, develop them, and how they are maintained in the brain. So concepts, the idea of what concepts are and categories are is relatively intuitive. Concepts are ideas, facts, knowledge. Categories are groups of concepts. So concepts are representations of objects, events, locations, etc. So there are many ways to form them, and we're kind of going to look at what we think is the most likely way they're formed and the order, possible order of ways they might be formed if multiple ways are used. I think I just alluded to that. Categories are a presentation of a group of objects. How are these two different? Why do we even have categories? And we'll get into some of those things in the next couple of lectures. So there's a couple ideas on how concepts and knowledge can be stored. One is based on similarity. So the idea behind similarity-based categories, or the idea of this theory, is that members of categories are based on similarities of features. So let's say birds, you're thinking about birds. Birds have multiple features that are very similar to each other. Feathers, a beak, feet, and they fly, and therefore the idea according to similarity-based category formation is that's how they're created and stored. And there's multiple subdivisions. That's the classic view. There's the prototype view and the exemplar view, and we'll go over each of these in the next couple of slides. And then there's another group of the story that explains how concepts and categories are stored, and that's the explanation-based view. And rather than sharing features, members of a category share a meaningful relationship to each other, like doctor and nurse, or mother and child. There's some type of logical relationship between the two that is independent of the features that they may or may not share. And then some spin-offs on this theory are the schemata view and the knowledge-based view. So in the classical view, concepts all share features. So for example, some features are very unique to a concept, like all phones have some kind of dial tone. Very few other objects have a dial tone. Usually dial tone is unique to phone, and therefore all phones have that dial tone. In other cases, there are a number of features must be present, but not entirely necessary. So think of a bottle in your head, what you think of as your typical bottle. And if you go through and think of the features it has, you're probably thinking it's clear, it might be colored green, it might be glass, it might be plastic. Is there a single feature that defines a bottle? Probably not, because some bottles are green, some are clear, some are plastic, some are short and fat, etc., etc. So they share many different features. This is a bottle, but it probably doesn't match the description or what you were thinking of when you thought of bottle. But technically it's a bottle. It's called a Klein bottle. So the classical view really doesn't seem to hold water, if you'll forgive the pun here. There must be something more sophisticated just beyond a sheer strict sharing of features that defines categories. So one idea is the idea of the prototype, that instead of sharing features, that we are comparing things to a prototype or an idealized representation of the concept or category in our head. So when you think of a bottle, you're probably thinking of an idealized bottle. My bottle was a green wine bottle. In fact, it doesn't even have a label on it. I was just thinking of a typical bottle. Some of you might have been thinking of a typical water bottle. So the interesting thing about the prototype is you may have never seen this in your life. It is a theoretical notion. Technically, it's the idea that it's the average of all the bottles that you've seen in your life up until now, that you sort of averaged them together to create a prototype of what you think a bottle is. So all members of the category share features with the prototype, but each individual member of the category may not share features with another member of the category. So the more features that are shared between the prototype and the example, the more likely that example is a member of the category. So I want you to think of your prototype phone in your head. Okay, visualize it. Everybody has a different prototype phone. My grandfather might have thought of this when he was thinking of a phone. Maybe you weren't because you're probably 70 years younger than he is. And his grandfather might have thought about that phone. Probably you weren't thinking of that, right? Your son or daughter, if you have one, might be thinking of this when you say telephone. And then some of you might be thinking of a cell phone. Now, this is an interesting example in the lower right here because this is a phone that's shaped like a cat. But the interesting thing about it is that it shares more features with a cat than it does with a phone. In fact, probably the only way you know it's a phone is by looking at the cord on its tail, which is a feature that's shared by other phones. But it has whiskers and it has ears and so on and so forth. So technically, according to the classical view, we would think of this as being more of a cat than a phone. But some of these things have some features in common that make them phone-like. And that might tie them together into this concept of a prototype phone. So one of the problems with both the classical and the prototype view is that some members of a category may share more features with the prototype of another category, like the cat. So again, another exercise. I want you to think of in your head, what is rap music? Think of a rap song in your head, a prototypical rap song. Now, some of you may be thinking of a specific song, but usually when I run this demo in class, most people are thinking of features of a song. It might have a strong beat, lyrics, a particular style of vocals, and so on and so forth. But some people are, curiously, they're not thinking of a particular song. When I say rap music, they think of a generic style of rap that shares common features. So this idea of a prototype doesn't have to just be with objects. It could be about any concept or category you have in your head. And so indeed, many of you might have been thinking of an average rap song. Let's see. All right. So what is the closest relative in the animal kingdom to the elephant? Many of you might be saying rhinoceros, perhaps. Hippopotamus, maybe. And that's probably because they share a lot of features. They're large animals. They're Indian and African, and they have similar coloring and texture to their skin. But actually, the closest relative to the elephant is the mouse. And that's because millions of years ago, they shared a common genetic line. But all the ancestors between their shared ancestor have died off. The woolly mammoth, mastodon, so on and so forth. All these giant mammals that were the precursors to the elephant have all died off. So the nearest living relative is the mouse, the common mouse. So they don't share too many features, although if you blow up the mouse, it becomes a little more evident that they're both mammals. So they're, members of a particular category might actually look very different as well. Another problem. So what is this object here? You probably identify the piano keys. So you identify it as a musical instrument, but what's all this yarn and stuff coming out? Well, back in the day, if you ever had the need to sew and play the harpsichord at the same time, this would have come in real handy. It's a keyboard of a piano. You might see the pedals poking out from underneath the keyboard. What the heck is that? How do you play that piano? What's a cross between an accordion and a piano? That didn't take off very well. Too many buttons. These are flute canes. They're flutes. They're canes. So I think you get what the point that I'm trying to make here is that there are some objects or categories that can fit two categories equally. It's a flute. It's a cane. So those are some problems with the classical and the prototype view. Not that they're saying that they're entirely wrong, but they're challenges that have to be addressed if we're going to explain this problem of category formation. So let's get to the exemplar view. So the idea of the exemplar view is that concepts are represented using actual examples the person has perceived. Um, so, by that token, all grandmothers will be compared to my grandmother. And no, that's not my grandmother. So you're thinking of something specific in your mind when you think of the phone or the rap song. You're thinking of your phone, or maybe the rap song that you like, or you're thinking of your favorite bottle that is a particular bottle that you know of. And that's the idea of the exemplar. It does suffer from the same problems as a prototype view. Um, and indeed, all of these problems share the same. All of those ideas, the classical prototype and exemplar view, um, are all part of the similarity-based viewpoint on category formation, and they all suffer from the problem that superficial physical features are not the only way to link members of a category. And so the explanation-based views started to make a little more sense, to define concepts by function or deeper meaning. One example of that is the schemata view. In the schemata view, remember schematas are theories about how the world works, you have a notion about how the world works, and you collect data on objects and categories and see how they compare to that notion. Scripts are a more refined variation of schemata. They're really the same thing, but they're behavioral schemata. So script is behavioral scenario about how the world works, like what is a prototypical date, how do you behave at dinner, what is a good night out. We can develop prototypical schemas to act out a script, or use exemplar scripts to develop schemas. So you think you might know how you should behave when you perform your first classical music concert, but that's really an exemplar script that you might have learned by watching other people do it, and then maybe you might have your own way of behaving in that environment. There might be a schema for a prototypical date, but your date that you decide to plan this evening might go differently. So the exemplar, or the schemata view says that you might use your first date as an exemplar, and then maybe develop that later on to develop your own prototype for what a date is. So technically, they would these schemata view still suffer from the same problems. It's difficult to find a prototypical script for going on a date. Everybody's prototype might be different. And the exemplar for everybody is going to be different as well. So it makes it difficult to make comparisons across individuals. Your concept of a date and my concept of a date might be very different, but we understand the idea and the category when we say we're going to go on a date, that we're talking about the same thing. And some dates share features with other activities more than other dates. For example, when I go to the internet and I type bad date, this is the picture that comes up. So some people might think this is really fun, and other people might think that it's like forced manual labor. Come over and paint my house, and maybe I'll make you cookies. It could be fun, or it could be terrible. Depends on how you look at it, but they don't look like they're having that much fun, do they? It's kind of got a half smile. Anyway, so this problem that categories are not very easy to strictly define based on the features that make them up, whether it's a similarity-based idea or the idea that your prototype might be different from my prototype. So we'll pick up with this concept in the next section.